Mob historians state that Dominic Santamaria came up inside a Brooklyn house where his uncle, Nino Gacci, set the tone for nearly everything. The place was roomy but plain, with several generations under one roof, a shared kitchen, and a family habit of keeping outsiders at a distance. Dominic's father had been gone since he was very young, and in the version repeated inside that house, he had failed his wife and child, and then disappeared from daily life. That left Nino as the loudest male presence in the building, and, over time, the one the boy watched most closely. He had opinions on every subject, spoke hard, and expected other people to accept his judgments as settled facts. Dominic grew up reading that atmosphere before he was old enough to understand what it was attached to. Nino Gacci had been born in 1925 on the Lower East Side of Manhattan to Angelo and Mary, a barber and a former seamstress, raising 3 children in a poor immigrant neighborhood. The Depression hit the family early and hard, and the boy was put to work young, first around his father's shop and then wherever else he could help. He grew up in streets where children, organized by block, fought often, and learned quickly that weakness cost money, respect, or both. A first communion photograph, taken when he was 7, showed a disciplined, rigid child, and the adults around him already treated his temper as something real and measurable. He attended parish school after his first public school years, ran deliveries, and spent time around Tompkins Square, where the toughest local boys made reputations with their fists. He knew the names of neighborhood fighters who later became famous, and he was already training himself to think in terms of force, nerve, and rank. Mafia documents describe a young Nino who developed contempt for the police early and never let it go. Street punishments from Irish cops, anti-police talk in his father's shop, and the plain sight of gambling, loan sharking, and fencing operations around him all pushed him in the same direction. He saw that the men who ran a legal business looked prosperous while the men enforcing the law did not seem to stop them. He copied their style, their stance, and even the movie versions of them, acting out gangster poses on street corners and admiring men who seemed untouchable. The biggest influence was Frank Scalise, a connected relative whose visits to the family home left a strong impression on the neighborhood and on the boy himself. By then, Nino was already saying he wanted 2 things out of life: to live like Scalise, and to die as a man still carrying force in his hand, not as someone who had gone soft. As a teenager, he sharpened his clothes, paid attention to how he looked, learned dice, and decided he liked the lenders around the game more than the gamblers in it. He saw money in other people's weakness and took that lesson seriously. He did not care much for school beyond what he had to finish, and when the family moved out to a small farm in New Jersey, he hated it. He even tried to enlist in the army during the war years, but poor eyesight got him rejected, which only added to his hostility toward men in uniform. The farm did not last long for the rest of the family either, and after 2 years they gave it up and headed instead to Bath Beach in Brooklyn. There they bought the brick house that became known inside the family as the Bunker, with the deed put in his sister Marie's name, partly because she handled English best. Bath Beach gave the family more room and a better neighborhood, but it also gave Nino a better base for what he wanted to become. He turned toward Frank Scalise, got work on a truck dock, moved up fast, and then left the job in practice while staying on the books as a ghost employee. That paper cover helped with taxes while he shifted into full-time criminal life. He worked hard when he had to, pushed older men around without hesitation, and made it clear he would not accept idleness or lateness from anyone below him. At home, his parents still saw a handsome, capable son finding his way, while his brother Roy remained in his shadow, and his sister Marie tried to build a more ordinary future. By the mid-1940s, the house held 2 tracks at once, a respectable family surface, and Nino's growing night business underneath it. Marie married Anthony Santamaria, a local boxer and butcher shop delivery man, and moved him into the same house. Nino had never respected him, thought he had no future, and made that plain from the start. He himself avoided liquor, avoided smoking, and took pride in staying in control, so he judged other men harshly and often. When Marie and Anthony's son Dominic was born, Nino became the boy's main daytime male caretaker simply by being the only adult in the house, not leaving for regular work each morning. At night, he made money in Brooklyn bars and pool halls, loan sharking, and doing other business no one in the house openly discussed. The tension with Anthony got worse after Nino tried to bring him into an insurance scam built around a staged car accident, and Anthony refused. From there, the household turned into a losing fight for the husband, and within a short time, he was drinking harder, arguing more, and then gone from the family's daily life. Our sources state that once Anthony was out, Nino effectively became the father figure in Dominic's world, and he trained the boy in silence, warning, and example rather than in direct explanation. When Dominic talked about becoming a policeman, Nino shut it down. When he mentioned becoming a soldier, he was told that men who died for institutions instead of family were fools. The boy absorbed those lessons even before he understood the full shape of the man teaching them. Then came the night the FBI raided the house and took Nino away in handcuffs on charges tied to a stolen car operation. Federal investigators said he and others had built fake paperwork for luxury cars, then matched stolen Cadillacs to those registrations, and sent them south and out of the country for cash. The case dragged for years, witnesses changed, co-defendants backed off, and in the end, he came through it without a conviction, while keeping to the rule that he would not cooperate with the authorities. Not long after that case was hanging over him, he married Rosemary Pizzella, a blonde telephone operator from nearby, and brought her into the first floor of the bunker. Dominic and his mother were pushed upward into tighter space, but the relationship between uncle and nephew still held. If he had business to do and no one to watch the boy, he took him along. That is how Dominic began seeing more of the men around Nino, including Paul Castellano and Carlo Gambino, both presented to him simply as important men worthy of attention. He watched how other men deferred, listened to talk he did not fully understand, and much later realized that some of Carlo's thinking came out of old political writing about gaining power and keeping it. At the same time, Dominic himself was growing, active in school and sports, while Nino was settling into a fuller, softer build from a life that used his mind and nerve more than his body. One small moment from school showed how deep the lessons at home were already set. Dominic came back proud that his classmates had chosen him to supervise the room when the teacher stepped out, and Nino treated the role as a form of informing, not a harmless school honor. The boy returned to class and gave it up, then refused to explain why. By then, he had also learned that even telling the truth in the wrong direction could count against family loyalty. Soon after, outside events pushed him further into that world. Frank Scalise was murdered, his loan records were recovered, his brother Joseph went missing, and then Albert Anastasia was killed as the city reacted to open underworld war. Dominic understood more from the news than the adults were willing to say to him directly, and when Nino told the family to stay inside the bunker for several days, the boy grasped that he was living through a dangerous period, and that silence was part of what was expected from him. The siege passed, and for a time his life looked ordinary again on the surface. He sang popular songs, played Little League, formed a neighborhood music group, went to Coney Island, and developed strong pride in being from Brooklyn. He also carried private knowledge that separated him from other boys his age. Then his mother decided to marry Anthony Montillo and move to Levittown on Long Island, putting real distance between her son and her brother's life. Dominic liked his future stepfather and agreed to use the Montillo name in school, even without a legal adoption, but he understood why his mother wanted out. She had seen enough to know that Nino's world brought killings, disappearances, and permanent danger to anyone standing too close. He left Brooklyn in 1960, not knowing that his uncle was about to settle the old Scalise score, finish a violent internal struggle, and secure full standing in the Gambino family through the disappearance and murder of Vincent Squillante, whose body, Nino later said, was taken back to his old neighborhood and destroyed in a furnace. Not long after Dominic Montiglio left for the army, Nino Gacci started paying attention to a younger man from Brooklyn named Roy DeMeo. DeMeo did not carry himself like a salesman or a polished public figure, but he had the qualities Nino respected most: street intelligence, energy, nerve, mechanical skill, and real experience with loans, cars, and street money before he even reached his mid-20s. He also had a cruel side that was already visible to people who knew him well, and Nino picked up on that fast. The introduction came through Bath Beach connections, after Roy's widowed mother moved in with another widow a few blocks from the Gacci house. Nino had already heard Roy's name from men tied to the smaller Lucchese world in Flatlands and Canarsie, where tow trucks, junkyards, and stolen car business were part of daily criminal commerce. Once he sent word that Roy should come by the next time he was in the neighborhood, Roy treated it as an opening he had no intention of wasting. Our sources state that Roy was ambitious enough to understand exactly what that invitation meant. Nino was a made man in the Gambino family, the strongest family in the city, and Roy had no interest in staying a small local thief with a future limited to junkyards and neighborhood bars. By 1966, he had already moved out to Massapequa Park on Long Island, where he built a large home on 3 adjoining lots and did much of the work himself. He lived there with his wife Gladys, who had reasons to regret the marriage, and with their growing family, while he kept one foot planted firmly in Brooklyn. Even in that suburban setting, he measured himself against bigger men, including Carlo Gambino, whose own country place was nearby. Roy drove past the boss's house often, studied the life that came with higher rank, and understood that he was still far below that level, no matter how much money he was making. Mafia documents describe Roy as a strange fit for the life in one important way. He did not come out of a poor, broken criminal household. His father was a strict, law-abiding laundry delivery driver, his mother stayed home, and other branches of the family had respectable professional success. One uncle was a prominent prosecutor tied to the Brooklyn District Attorney's Office. Another ran a Buick dealership, and another relative held a major medical position in New York City. His mother wanted a doctor in the family, and Roy later liked to say he had ended up as the black sheep instead. From Massapequa Park, he still drove into Brooklyn to work his real base of operations, a bar called Phil's Lounge near the neighborhood where he had grown up. He liked suburban comfort, but his real life remained rooted in old Brooklyn habits, old grudges, and old criminal friendships. Roy's childhood had started in a crowded red brick house on Avenue P, where several relatives lived under one roof, and the family watched every dollar. He was badly overweight as a boy, and an easy target for other kids, who mocked him, humiliated him, and treated him like soft prey. The person who protected him was his older brother Anthony, known as Chubby, a strong and popular young man who became Roy's first real model of power. Then Chubby volunteered for the Marines during Korea and was killed, and the whole DeMeo household changed after that. His mother went into prolonged grief, his father never seemed fully happy again, and Roy started pushing his anger outward. He kept getting good grades, but he also turned into a bullying, resentful young man whose private rage kept building. He was also becoming fascinated with gangsters. His father ordered him to stay away from the Profassi boys who lived nearby, yet Roy liked sitting on the stoop with them and watching powerful mob figures pull up in expensive cars on poker nights. The glamour that had once attached to military service shifted in his mind toward organized crime, and his mother did little to stop that change since she remained friendly with the Profasi family. At James Madison High School, he proved he was not stupid at all. He earned good marks, got conduct awards, showed up on time, stayed dependable in school settings, and still chose manual arts over the longer path his mother wanted for him. Just as important, he heard stories from his prosecutor uncle about mafia cases falling apart when witnesses changed their story on the stand, and he understood the lesson. Intimidation worked, silence worked, and fear had value. After school, Roy built his world around Phil's lounge and the young men orbiting it. That crowd included future burglars, local workers, cops, bookmakers, and several men who would move deeper into organized crime. He learned about guns from Frank Ferangi, picked up shooting technique from police-trained John Doherty, and kept expanding his range of contacts. One of the most useful friendships came through Freddie Denomi, a dyslexic mechanic from Canarsie who had been mocked by others but could do remarkable work with cars. Freddie became fiercely loyal to Roy, and Roy knew how to use loyalty when it came attached to talent. Through Freddie, he met thieves, hijackers, junkyard people, motorcycle crews, and a long list of men who needed loans, introductions, protection, buyers, or places to unload stolen property. By his early 20s, Roy had no more interest in legitimate employment. He quit honest work, learned stolen car operations firsthand, took part in break-ins, fenced property, and became the neighborhood man people went to when they needed criminal help. At the same time, he developed a deep fear of the Internal Revenue Service and started taking steps to create a paper cover for his life. He arranged with business owners to keep him on payrolls as a fake employee so his tax filings would not stop altogether, then spent time worrying over how much income he could safely claim while still living well. He even approached an IRS agent he knew from school and tried to get information on how net worth cases were built. When that effort failed, Roy took the rejection personally and later made a point of insulting the agent in public. That mix of calculation, resentment, and paranoia stayed with him as his money grew. In 1966, his ambitions moved to a new level when he aimed directly at the Gambino family through Nino Gacci. He already knew enough about the structure to understand the value of proximity to power. Under Carlo Gambino, the family controlled hundreds of made men and a large network of associates working gambling, labor rackets, stolen goods, prostitution, loan sharking, and business infiltration across the city. Carlo opposed narcotics, convinced that drug sentences created informants, but the family still generated enormous cash through everything else. Nino was already drawing steady income from loans to jewelry shops, trucking businesses, repair shops, used car lots, gas stations, and dealerships, and he had quietly taken pieces of businesses that fell behind. He saw in Roy a man who could enlarge that stream, and Roy saw in Nino a path upward that none of his neighborhood contacts could offer. They began with shared loans and moved from there. Roy picked up payments, brought Nino his share, and used those errands to deepen the relationship. During the same period, he also started backing a younger figure named Chris Rosenberg, first with marijuana money and then with larger criminal opportunities. By 1970, Roy was effectively working under Nino and paying him substantial weekly tribute. By 1972, he had gathered a younger crew of car thieves, drug dealers, and shooters around himself, while still feeding money upward. Outside business, he entertained them at barbecues, took them to see Broadway Freddy race, and let them fire weapons from the growing arsenal he kept. He also took over Phil's lounge financially, had it reborn as the Gemini Lounge under another man's name on paper, and used it as both social base and criminal office. The suburban picture in Massapequa Park looked respectable enough to fool most people who saw only the surface. Roy was helpful with neighbors, maintained the yard, put up a strong fence himself, decorated heavily for holidays, and hosted block parties with fireworks that local police largely ignored. Gladys baked for neighborhood children and helped keep the household outwardly normal. At the same time, the house had bars on windows, a sophisticated alarm system, and a constant stream of suspicious visitors arriving in expensive cars. Roy could play the good neighbor when it suited him, and he could also switch fast into a hard neighborhood enforcer, as shown when he took his dog into nearby woods and drove off teenagers he believed were using drugs behind his property. While all of that went on, he kept scanning for new ways to turn money. One example was his move into a Brooklyn credit union, where he talked his way onto the board and then used the institution to help launder drug money and support his own expanding loan book. That same period also put Roy and Nino into official law enforcement files. Complaints about the credit union activity brought Roy's name to police attention, and an informant later told the FBI that two men known as Roy and Nino had muscled into a company that processed pornographic films. The importance of that note went beyond paperwork. It marked Roy moving into a world where violent enforcement, forced takeovers, and murder contracts would become standard parts of business. Detective Kenny McCabe also began noticing Freddie Denomey around the Gemini during his own surveillance runs, and Freddie recognized him from an old gambling arrest. The two exchanged abuse across the street, and Roy later approached McCabe in a friendlier tone, joking about Freddie's instability and showing that he enjoyed the tension when no higher-ranking men were present. Freddie, meanwhile, had become Roy's armed lookout during sensitive meetings, with standing instructions that if anyone ever came out and said Roy was calling for him, he was to shoot and run, since Roy would likely already be dead. Separate investigators were also getting closer to the stolen car and murder network around Roy. Joseph Wendling and Assistant District Attorney Stephen Samuel were chasing leads in the John Quinn case and got useful cooperation from William Camp in Florida, who said Peter LaFrancia had admitted killing Quinn on the ground that he was a rat. Rather than move too quickly, they used that information to push LaFrancia into a probation violation and send him away while they kept building. At the same time, NYPD auto crime officer John Murphy was trying to convince his superiors to back a full investigation into mafia control of the city's stolen car trade. He had learned enough to link Roy to Patty Tester and other thieves, and to suspect multiple murders around that circle. Nassau officer Charles Meade was finding stripped Nassau County cars in Canarsie over and over, and Murphy began comparing notes with both Wendling and McCabe. They started their own surveillance efforts, but budget problems, manpower shortages, and rotating supervisors kept the case from becoming the full-scale operation it needed to be. While the police were inching forward, Dominic Montiglio was drifting deeper into trouble on his own side of the family. After Nino became a capo and Roy got his button, Dominic started thinking hard about what his future might be. Nino told him Paul had blocked a button for him on age grounds and said he needed to wait. In the meantime, Dominic kept doing pickups, still bought cars for Matty Riga, and spent more and more time in bars, clubs, and restaurants where people bought him drinks and treated him like a rising man. Rhaegar also began laying out cocaine more freely when Dominic came around, and the drug use started to become regular. At home, Denise noticed him coming back unsteady, but she did not yet know how much of his life was shifting under the surface. A new friendship made that shift sharper. Dominic became close with Emile Buzzy Scioli, a clever and educated Gambino associate he met while both were supervising gambling tables at mafia-sponsored casino nights hidden behind synagogue fundraising fronts. When Dominic repeated things Carlo Gambino had told him about ruling with force and cunning, Buzzy recognized the ideas immediately and handed him a copy of The Prince. Dominic read it fast and took it seriously, keeping it with him and treating it like a guide to the life around him. At the same time, he was growing bitter over money. Nino still paid him only $250 a week, the same basic salary he had been living on for years, even while Dominic handled his affairs. watched RNA sales during long Florida stays, stored large amounts of Nino's cash, and moved money between Nino, Roy, and Paul. Roy's young men, especially Chris, were making far more, and Chris did not mind reminding him of that. The resentment turned into action. Dominic started buying and reselling Riga's cocaine to support his own habit and make extra money, then met Pedro Rodriguez, known as Paz, and gained direct access to cheaper cocaine, plus paid work as an armed bodyguard on deals in Queens. He stayed away from home more often, spent nights and weekends with Henry, Buzzy, Riga, and later Mickey Featherstone, and moved through Studio 54, Xenon, and other spots with increasing regularity. He cheated on Denise, drank heavily, took a massage parlor outing as a birthday gift from Danny Grillo, and by late summer of 1978, he was doing large amounts of cocaine and liquor as part of an ordinary day. Denise knew there was drug use in the circle, but not the extent of it. Physically, he changed as well, getting leaner in the face and upper body, wearing black more often, and giving off the look people associated with a hard gangster the moment he entered a room. Nino noticed the attitude change, but not the full drug picture, and he started telling his nephew that he was acting more like a punk than a serious man. Then came Cheryl Anderson. Dominic met her at a dealer's apartment when he, Buzzy, and Henry were leaving, and she chose to walk out with them. She came from a wealthy Long Island contracting family, yet she had become a major Quaalude dealer and fit easily into their late 70s drug world. Through an elderly Greenwich Village pharmacist named Frank Ellman, she had access to huge numbers of pills, and soon she was selling with the rest of them around clubs and bars. The group treated her as one of their own, gave her a gold pill-shaped piece of jewelry, and folded her into the circle they were building around a Fort Lee penthouse crash pad they nicknamed Hole in the Wall. Dominic called every day to say he was alive, but his life was now split in two, with one half tied to family and the other tied to drugs, women, crime, and nights that rolled into morning. One night, after a weekend of abuse, he collapsed in Nino's den watching football, bit through his tongue, and sent the whole house into panic before regaining consciousness and going right back to the same behavior after sleeping it off. His relations with the DeMeo crew also worsened during a dispute over stolen cars sold through Matty Rager. One of several cars bought from Patty Testa Motors was seized by the FBI after a title problem exposed fake paperwork linked back to the Quinn investigation. Riga faced demands for a refund, Patty refused to cover it, and Roy showed no interest in helping. Henry even waved a gun in Rager's face during one family gambling event to make sure he kept lying to the FBI about the car. Dominic tried to lean on Patty during a sit-down. Patty walked out on him, then broke crew etiquette by telling Denise that her husband was an asshole who had come at him like a bully. Furious, Dominic complained to Nino, who in his own bad mood told him that if he wanted Patty dead, he did not care. Dominic armed himself, picked up Buzzy and Henry, followed Patty, then backed off during the drive and admitted it was too small a thing to kill over, even though he knew that one day, if he stayed where he was, refusing that sort of order might stop being an option. Roy, meanwhile, was thinking bigger than ever and growing looser about the kind of people he brought in. He told Freddie that a major car operation was coming and hinted that there would be so much money Freddie could afford his own driver. Into that atmosphere stepped Vito Arena, a recently paroled former John Quinn car thief who had once been highly effective at stealing vehicles before his size made some of the work harder. Vito told Freddie he wanted something legitimate, but Freddie laughed that off and steered him back towards stolen cars. Freddie connected him with his brother Richie Denomi and with Joey Scorney, a highly skilled freelancer who could defeat security systems and drive off cars in under a minute. Scorney was making very good money already and wanted no part of Mafia control, but Richie remained eager to keep the Mafia option open, especially with Freddie hinting that Roy was building something enormous. That enormous plan was Roy's Kuwait deal. He told Freddie he had reached an arrangement with an Arab buyer who wanted late-model American gas guzzlers shipped overseas, and he laid out a structure that would begin with a handful of cars a month and expand to large weekly numbers if all went well. The price was strong. The overseas destination reduced some of the immediate title risk, and Roy believed he had enough car business contacts and police information to keep the pipeline moving. Freddie said he could get more than enough cars through Richie and Scorney. Richie liked the idea. Vito agreed, as long as they avoided the most high-profile luxury models, and Scorney still refused to work for mafia men. Not long after, the conflict ended with Scorney dead. The accounts of motive changed over time, but the key facts remained. Vito and Richie planned the killing, used a bad weapon and bad ammunition, shot him, beat him with a hammer when the gun failed, robbed him, sealed him in a cement-filled barrel, looted his apartment and hidden cash, and then panicked over how to dispose of the body. Freddie became involved when Richie called him in fear the next morning. Freddie told him to dump the barrel in the ocean, then found himself pulled in directly when Richie and another helper drove the van out to Long Island and needed guidance. Freddie left his own anniversary gathering, led them to a fishing pier, and helped roll the barrel out, turning himself into an accomplice after the fact. Weeks later, he told Roy about Vito, though not about every mistake made during the murder. Roy met Vito at Freddie's shop while still talking through the Kuwait operation, praised what he had heard, and brought both Vito and Richie into his orbit. By then, Roy was moving pornography into New Jersey and Rhode Island, using an Irish gang on the west side, buying narcotics tied to Central American supply, lending money across the city, arranging murders for others, and widening his reach in almost every direction. At a party at his large white house in Massapequa Park, he even boasted to Dominic that he had killed more than 50 men. At that point, the number was still false, but the direction of his life was clear. Mob historians state that the first problem in this stretch was not one of the later new recruits, but Danny Grillo. His weakness was gambling, and for a while almost nobody outside a tight circle understood how bad it had become. During another of the large synagogue casino nights run for connected interests, Dominic Montiglio and Buzzy were trusted with the money side of the room, while hot food, liquor, valet service, and hundreds of thousands in house money kept the games moving. Danny leaned on his friendship with Dominic and asked for markers he had no business getting, and Dominic, against his better judgment, let a few go through. Danny then chased the dice into a hole so deep that he was down $100,000, and Dominic and Buzzy, already in panic, destroyed half the paper so the debt showed as 50. Even that smaller figure was far beyond Danny's reach, and once Roy DeMeo had to cover it, the whole thing stopped looking like a gambling problem and started looking like a family liability. Our sources state that the warning did not hold for even a week. Danny went into another game in Manhattan, played on credit again, and came out owing roughly $150,000 more. Roy DeMeo and Nino Gacci brought him in, shouted at him, threatened him, and still fronted the money to keep the matter from blowing back on them. Danny promised once again that the gambling was over, then did something even more reckless and tried to get Jimmy Coonan to borrow from Roy without telling Roy the money was really for him. A short time later, his wife called Dominic in panic, saying Danny had locked himself in the garage with the car running. By the time Dominic got there, Danny had already come back inside, still wearing a bathrobe, still using cocaine, and still talking like a man who thought he had reached the end. Dominic tried to calm him down, and also tried to keep the matter quiet, since a failed suicide attempt in that world could read as weakness. And weakness invited decisions from men like Roy DeMeo and Nino Gacci that were usually final. Mafia documents describe Roy DeMeo as having already decided what Danny now represented. Once he heard about the suicide attempt and the fresh debt, he concluded Danny was unstable, frightened, and likely to talk if the police ever touched him for anything at all. Nino Gacci, distracted by his own federal troubles, did not argue hard. Dominic briefly considered warning Danny to run, but he also knew he had already crossed lines of his own by helping make those earlier markers disappear, and any move that looked like helping Danny could have put him in the ground too. When he finally went to the Gemini to try talking Roy out of whatever was coming, he was already too late. Outside, he found Chris and the twins in a satisfied mood, laughing in a way that told him the work was done. And inside, Roy made it plain that Danny's car had been left on the Manhattan Bridge to sell a suicide story while the real remains had gone elsewhere. Danny had not vanished in some mysterious street accident. He had been summoned in, taken apart, and used as another lesson. That murder widened the distance between Dominic and the worst part of the DeMeo crew. He had already been angry with Nino Gacci for blocking an opportunity with Paul that could have put him into a better paid role and possibly into a legitimate business arrangement. Nino made the choice on his own, never asked what Dominic wanted, and then brushed him off when the younger man protested. The old line remained the same: work under me, do what you are told, wait your turn, and stop acting like the future belongs to you. Dominic said more than once that he did not need a button, yet he never fully believed his own voice when he said it. What he did believe was that he could not spend the rest of his life trapped in the bunker, living on a fixed allowance, while older men around him controlled every lane that paid real money. That frustration pushed him towards schemes of his own, not toward retirement or withdrawal. He built one of those schemes in the South Bronx and later in New Jersey with Buzzy Scioli and Henry Borelli. The method was simple and dirty. Dominic renewed contact with Black and Hispanic bar owners he had known from the days when he worked around Matty Rager's business. Then Buzzy and Henry would appear separately as threatening outsiders, carrying themselves like men collecting for unseen captains. After the owners got rattled, Dominic would return in a friendlier role, say he might be able to help, invent a higher weekly demand, then present a lower compromise number that the frightened owner would gratefully hand over to him directly. The whole thing ran on bluff, posture, and the reputation of people who were never actually involved. It brought in a few $1,000s a month and sometimes more, and Dominic burned through much of it on cocaine, jewelry, meals, gifts, nightlife, and the image he wanted to project to his wife and the people around him. For a short time, he still felt partly responsible for Danny's death. He knew that when he rushed out to the Grillo house and told Nino there was trouble over there, he may have been the man who drew attention to Danny at exactly the wrong moment. That guilt thinned out once Roy told him Danny had also helped wipe out gambling markers while tied into the Ruby Stein murder lane, which made Roy treat him as a danger from more than one direction. Even so, the killing shook Dominic's circle. Henry called in fear and wondered aloud whether he might be next, then stood outside a Soho bar in a rigid pose and told Dominic that if the order ever came, he would rather die by his hand than someone else's. Dominic heard something final in that moment. A friendship built on late nights, fast money, and shared secrets had started to lose its last trace of trust. And from there on, the two men kept operating together, more out of business necessity than real loyalty. Our sources state that Dominic kept widening his life in all directions at once. He renewed ties with Richard Amelow from the old Levittown years, and got to know Richard's girlfriend, Gina Davis, who was studying acting while working in Manhattan. They even babysat for Dominic and Denise from time to time, without knowing that heavy weapons were hidden inside the apartment, including an army-issued machine gun concealed beneath furniture in a child's room. He also resumed a relationship with the Swedish woman who managed the Spartacus Spa, a place already familiar from his nights with Danny and others. That connection later became useful when the Westies paid with counterfeit bills, and Roy needed pressure applied to someone who had spoken with federal agents. Around the same period, Dominic and Denise met one of Roy DeMaio's uncles in Greenwich Village and got, for the first time in full, the story of Anthony Santamaria's break with Marie and the role Nino Gacci had played in it. What Dominic heard from that older man hardened a suspicion he had carried for years. His father had not simply failed on his own. He had been ground down inside a house where Nino controlled the money, the tone, and the options. Then, in the first week of December 1978, Dominic survived another near-death incident and walked away almost untouched. Driving home at sunrise after another long night of collections and hustles, he went into a violent head-on collision on the Belt Parkway exit toward Bath Beach. The other driver was badly hurt. The front end of Dominic's Lincoln was crushed, and yet he came away with little more than a sore neck. He spoke about it afterward in the fatalistic way many of them did, as if death had looked over and decided not to collect yet. Nino Gacci gave him no comfort, only another lecture about staying out all night, drinking, and acting reckless. A few days later, Nino himself caught a major break when the judge removed him from the Westchester Premier Theatre case for lack of proof that he had known enough to be convicted. The celebration brought Dominic back into his uncle's better graces for the moment, and during that brief calm, Nino told him to keep his eyes on Roy DeMaio, who he believed was making large sums on the side through a new car lane. Dominic soon brought Roy and Nino business, without fully telling either man what the money was for. Matty Rager and Pedro Paz Rodriguez needed $96,000 fast, and the collateral Paz scraped together came in the form of flashy jewelry stuffed into a gym bag. Nino Gacci had one of his jewelers look at it, decided it was worth enough, and put up half the money from his hidden cash. Roy supplied the other half, and the expectation was that $102,000 would be returned the next day. Dominic left out the cocaine angle and left out the names of the real lenders when he went back to Paz. The repayment came late. He stretched away for several days, and when he finally returned, he had $108,000 instead of the original figure. Nino's anger disappeared as soon as he counted the extra, which reminded Dominic once again that in that house, almost every problem could be softened, at least temporarily, by handing over more cash than expected. Mafia documents describe the opening months of 1979 as the point where the DeMaio crew's killing apparatus stopped being occasional and turned systematic. More money was coming in, more people were involved, more rip-offs were being attempted, and the group had already grown used to removing obstacles through murder. The process inside Joseph Guglielmo's apartment behind the Gemini had settled into a fixed pattern. Targets were lured into the clubhouse if possible, shot in the head, stabbed again to stop the heart from moving blood, hung upside down in the bathroom to drain, then laid out on plastic, cut apart, packed, and taken away. Chris liked doing the knife work in his underwear so he would not ruin expensive clothes, while the others used gloves and kept moving as if the job were no more remarkable than shop work. Dominic, now watching Roy more closely on Nino's orders, saw the pace increase almost immediately. One Friday night, after a live band drew a normal neighborhood crowd into the Gemini Lounge, a young patron insulted Roy within earshot of a loyal barmaid, and within minutes, Roy had the man outside, inside his Cadillac, and dead from a shot fired just yards away from witnesses who did not yet understand what they had seen. When Dominic reported that Roy DeMaio was now out of control, Nino Gacci reacted with the same half measure he kept using. He asked whether anyone else had seen the shooting, and said he would speak to Roy, but Dominic had little faith that any real discipline would follow unless Roy's behavior damaged Nino directly. The killing continued. Peter Waring got out of jail too quickly and was judged a possible cooperator, so he disappeared. Frederick Todaro, A 60-year-old whose nephew wanted full control of film processing businesses and entry into the pornography trade with Roy, was brought into the clubhouse on the excuse of a used car deal. Freddie Denomi helped lure him there, and then stood frozen as Roy, Chris, Joey, and Anthony ran the full bathroom routine in front of him. The body was cut, bagged, and moved with the same loose calm Freddie had seen in other jobs. And later Vito Arena noticed the repainted floor near the bathroom and was told that a lot of history sat under that paint. By then, the crew had already started killing at a rate that dragged even men on the edge of the circle deeper into guilt, fear, and silence. The next crisis grew out of an older habit of Roy's, which was turning loans and business friendships into traps. Years earlier, he had befriended Charles Padnick, a body shop owner who installed bulletproof windows for one of his Cadillacs. Padnick later moved to Miami Beach, fell into trouble, and borrowed first $20,000 from Roy, and then more from others just to cover the vig. Padnick's wife knew Chris under a false name from old Catskills vacations, not realizing that Harvey Rosenberg had become one of Roy's most dangerous men. To try saving the business, Charles and his son Jamie moved into cocaine through an employee named William Serrano, who had ties to a Cuban known only as El Negro through another intermediary called Pepon. The first 1-kilo transaction with Chris went through, and then a much larger 12-kilo deal was arranged for St. Patrick's Day of 1979. Chris and Anthony went south, talked big, and never intended to pay once the shipment came north. The trip back to New York brought in Charles Padnick, Serrano, and 2 people aligned with El Negro, including the mother of his child and a cousin who acted as bodyguard. Someone on that end appears to have sensed the setup too late, as shots were fired during the confrontation, and Chris later turned up at a hospital with wounds he tried to explain away through a fake traffic story. What mattered more was that none of the people who carried the cocaine got back to Florida, and once no reassuring phone call came south, panic started moving through the Cuban side at once. Muriel Padnick fielded frantic calls in the middle of the night. Jamie began scanning papers for signs of a bust, and when he could not find answers, he flew to New York himself and disappeared as well. Muriel called Roy DeMaio for help, using the number her husband had left for emergencies, and Roy lied to her just as smoothly as he lied to everyone else. Meanwhile, El Negro, now dealing not with a lost shipment but with lost people, began promising retaliation. The worst mistake in the whole affair was not just the rip-off. It was Chris's need to impress outsiders by sometimes calling himself Chris DeMaio and boasting that Roy was his father and a major man in Brooklyn. Serrano passed that information along before leaving Florida, and it gave El Negro something he could chase. Through Paz Rodriguez, who knew Rhaegar and Dominic as regular customers, the Cubans pushed the question north. Paz handed Dominic a name written on paper, asked whether he knew a man called Chris DeMaio, and explained that 5 people tied to a cocaine deal had vanished. Dominic understood quickly enough what had likely happened, and he also understood that Rhaegar had already given Paz enough context to know the Brooklyn lane was close to the truth. He took the message back home, and Nino Gacci's first response said everything about how he viewed Roy's people by then. What had those cowboys done now? Roy DeMaio tried to stall and misdirect in the first hours, telling Dominic to buy time with the Cubans until he could find out what had happened, though neither Dominic nor Nino believed for a second that he was in the dark. When Paz made it clear that men were coming north from Florida, and that this was no longer just a question floating around a drug apartment, Roy shifted his story. Now Chris had used his name without permission, and Joey and Anthony had been involved too, turning the whole thing into a problem that could not simply be laughed off inside the Gemini. Dominic described it as their own Bay of Pigs, a local disaster built out of overconfidence, bad discipline, and men who thought nobody outside Brooklyn could strike back. In a diner across from Tommaso's, Roy repeated his version for Nino, who listened, took the threat seriously, and still answered in the old style. The line he settled on was simple and cold. If the Cubans needed a name, give them Chris. That decision did not solve the crisis. It only showed how far the crew had already gone, and how quickly one of their own could be pushed forward once the killing machine began threatening the men above it. Mob historians state that after Chris Rosenberg and Dominic Rigucci were gone, Roy DeMeo did not slow down. He chose Joey Testa as his new right hand instead of Henry Borelli, even though Henry had been around longer and expected the spot. Roy liked Joey's style, trusted him more, and wanted a man beside him who would not hesitate in the hard work. Henry took the decision badly, and Roy tried to smooth it over by handing him a profitable role in the Kuwait stolen car operation. That move kept Henry earning and kept him close, but it did not fix the resentment. From that point forward, the crew had more money moving than ever, and more reasons to kill. Our sources state that the Kuwait car deal was structured like a business, with every man assigned a lane. Ronald Ustica, a used car dealer from Baldwin, Long Island, handled the shipping end after meeting Arab buyers who wanted second-hand American cars resold in Kuwait. One of those buyers, Abdullah Hassan, agreed to take stolen cars at a bargain price, knowing he could still make strong money overseas. Roy DeMeo put Freddie Denomi and Richie Denomi into the operation, gave Henry Borelli the paperwork side, and reserved a cut for Nino Gacci and for Paul Castellano at Toad Hill. Richie and Vito Arena stole the cars. Freddie replaced locks and helped alter identification. Henry created false papers, and Ustica moved the vehicles toward Newark for shipment abroad. The profits came fast enough that everyone in the chain began treating it as the best thing going. Mafia documents describe the desired inventory in exact terms. The crew focused on late-model General Motors cars, especially Chevrolet Caprices, Oldsmobile Regencies, and Buick Electras, with a preference for four-door cars that could later serve as taxis. They looked for low mileage, good condition, electric seats and windows, and most of all, velour interiors, since the Kuwaiti buyers did not want leather. Richie and Vito cruised mostly at night, often through Borough Park, and left the stolen vehicles near Freddie's shop with a signal so the next phase could begin. From there, the cars were retagged, provided with altered paperwork, moved out to Nassau County, then eventually taken to Newark and shipped out. For the first several months, almost everything worked cleanly enough that the partners were clearing $7,000 to $9,000 a week each. The first cracks showed when complaints started coming from Kuwait and from the people around the deal. Hassan griped that some cars were arriving without radios, which forced Roy DeMeo to tell Freddie Denomi to stop stripping them for extra cash. Roy also complained that he had to pay detectives Peter Calabro and John Doherty to check vehicle numbers and help prevent problems, while still sharing money with Nino Gacci and Paul Castellano. Then, a separate buyer, Khaled Fard Darwish Daoud, began noticing that Caprices were disappearing from the legal auction market in New Jersey. He went to Pier 292 in Newark, saw lines of cars bound for Kuwait, copied numbers, and confronted Ronald Ustica directly. Once Ustica brought that problem back to Roy DeMeo, the decision was immediate and familiar. Daoud had to be killed. Roy DeMeo, Henry Borelli, Freddie Denomi, and Vito Arena first tried to get Daoud at the Diplomat Hotel in Rockville Center. The plans stalled when Roy realized he had failed to bring a silenced weapon, and Henry's phone call for Richie Denomi to bring one ended in disaster when Richie accidentally shot himself in the hand while handling the gun. The crew backed off that attempt, but the delay did not reduce the danger around them. At almost the same time, the old drug issue inside the Gambino family came back around. Jimmy Eppolito accused Nino Gacci and Roy DeMeo of going off the record in narcotics for years, after his son lost money in a cocaine deal and complained. Paul Castellano sided with Nino, not with the Eppolitos. and by doing that, he effectively signed both Jimmy Sr. and Jimmy Jr. over to the Gemini method. Nino Gacci and Roy DeMeo solved the access problem by using Peter Piacente, an older soldier Jimmy Ippolito trusted. Piacente was told there would be a sit-down at the Gemini and that his presence would make everyone feel safe on the ride over. Instead, on the night of October 1st, Nino sat in the front seat with Jimmy Jr. driving, while Roy sat in the rear with Jimmy Sr. and Piacente between them. When Jimmy Sr. sensed something was wrong and demanded that his son pull over, Nino and Roy drew at the same time. Nino shot Jimmy Jr. in the head, Roy shot Jimmy Sr., and the whole thing happened on a service road off the Belt Parkway, with another car passing nearby at the worst possible moment. What was meant to be a clean setup immediately turned into a public shooting with live witnesses. One of those witnesses was Patrick Penny, a small-time burglar who usually would have wanted no part of police business. That night he stopped, looked back, and watched three men come out of the Thunderbird, one slender and two heavier, with blood visible on some of them under a street lamp. Instead of driving away, he tried to get help and ended up flagging down an off-duty Housing Authority police sergeant, Paul Roeder, who was moonlighting in a car service. Roeder moved on Nino Gacci and Peter Piacente near a gas station, identified himself, and ordered them to stop. Nino tried to maneuver for position, then turned and fired at Roeder first, missing him. Roeder fired back, hit Nino in the neck and Piacente in the leg, and only avoided shooting Nino again when Nino became too weak to lift the pistol he was still reaching for on the pavement. At the hospital, the damage looked worse than it really was. Nino Gacci was under arrest, but alive, and Dominic Montiglio arrived thinking his uncle might be dying. Roy DeMeo showed up too, claimed family status, and then tried to explain himself outside, where Dominic tore into him for leaving Nino exposed again and not staying with him when things went wrong. Roy brushed past the insult and said there were bigger problems now, especially with Paul Castellano, who would not like hearing how Peter Piacente had been used. They went to Staten Island, picked up Thomas Bellotti, and took the matter to Paul's house. The answer for the moment was to go home and wait, but Roy DeMeo was never built for waiting. The next stretch showed just how desperate and unstable his thinking had become. He talked about bribing Patrick Penny, killing Paul Roeder, and even storming Rikers Island with scuba gear and machine guns to pull Nino Gacci out of the prison hospital. Dominic Montiglio shut down the wildest ideas, but one scheme stayed alive: switching the bullet in Nino's neck for another round that ballistics could not tie to Roeder's weapon. Roy climbed into a sewer to recover the gun he had thrown away, fired a fresh round into water, and handed the ballistically useful bullet to Dominic. During a visit to Rikers, Dominic hid it in his mouth, passed it to Nino by hand, and Nino later swapped it in after forcing the original bullet from his own wound. At the same time, the crew sent Dominic, Henry, Joey, and Anthony to Patrick Penny's brother with a message that mixed threat and bribery, offering $50,000 up front if Patrick said the right thing. While all of that was happening, the Kuwait car lane got even larger. Roy moved the work from Freddie's small garage into a former milk company warehouse that could hold 20 cars at a time, and another warehouse in Baldwin was used to store ready shipments. The money rose with the scale, to the point where active partners and even the men above them were taking home extraordinary weekly sums. Roy began talking about eventually leveling off at 100 cars a week, not out of restraint, but only to keep the system from drawing too much attention at once. Then, Peter Calabro tipped Roy that Khaled Daoud had finally contacted police and was writing a letter laying out the stolen car allegations. That information sealed Daoud's fate, and the crew set a new trap using Freddie's shop as the kill site. Ronald Ustica arranged for Daoud to hear that Freddie Denomi had the kind of caprices he wanted, and Daoud agreed to come inspect them. The only surprise was that he decided to bring along another used car dealer, Ronald Falcaro, who had been helping him try to buy vehicles the legitimate way. Roy answered that change without hesitation. He armed everyone in advance, placed Vito Arena by the car near the shop door, kept Roy, Henry, Joey and Anthony hidden in the dark inside, and waited for Freddie to bring both men in. Once the victims stepped into the dark shop and Freddie slipped back out, the silenced guns went off, and Falcaro tried to reach the door before Vito held it shut from the other side. After the shooting, the lights came on, knives and plastic came out, and the bodies were reduced to packages that could be moved and dumped through channels already familiar to the crew. The work did not stop with the killings. Henry Borelli and Vito Arena went to Daoud's hotel room, removed his belongings, and brought them back so Roy DeMeo could shape the story into a disappearance rather than a murder. Among the papers they found was a typed letter Daoud had prepared for authorities, laying out the stolen car operation to Kuwait. Donna Falcaro, Ronald's wife, reported her husband missing, and Nassau officer Charles Meade quickly suspected he was dead as soon as he heard the Brooklyn connection. Ronald Ustica played the concerned businessman when questioned, and even suggested that Daoud was the dangerous one. Like so many other lanes around Roy DeMeo, the investigation stalled while the people responsible kept moving. By then, Dominic Montiglio's contempt for the crew had become harder to hide. It had been building since Danny Grillo, since the crew started equating hesitation with weakness, and since Roy began treating murder as a routine answer to every problem that got in his way. At the pear tree, where Dominic still crossed paths with figures from outside that world, Henry Borelli told him that Roy had chosen Joey Testa over him, and admitted that Roy feared only Nino Gacci. Then, Henry added one more detail that sent Dominic over the edge. Roy had paid Nino $150,000 off the top from the Cuban cocaine lane, while Dominic, who had helped save the whole situation, got nothing but shouting when he expected a share. That confirmed what he had already started to believe. Roy DeMeo and Nino Gacci trusted him enough to use him, but not enough to reward him, and the anger that followed was no passing mood. Mob historians state that after Paul Castellano took over, he moved men around, settled disputes, and began setting his own order inside the family, but DeMeo got nothing from it. Nino Gacci was elevated, which raised his standing and effectively made him the main Brooklyn power under Paul, even if many of the older men in his crew were half-retired bookmakers and loan men who handled little beyond errands and routine business. Roy saw that promotion up close and took it hard. He had been sending steady money upward for years, yet he was still only an associate while older, less active men technically outranked him. Nino himself did not think a promotion would help Roy, since once he became a member, Paul would expect stricter discipline and would start paying closer attention to the drug lane and the more twisted film business Roy already had around him. Roy did not care about any of that. He wanted the status, the protection, and the confirmation that he belonged. Our sources state that the same period brought in the Veterans and Friends Club on 86th Street, which Paul wanted as a fixed meeting place for the Brooklyn side. Nino chose a cheap storefront and had Dominic Montiglio and other younger men clean it up, paint it, build a bar, stock coffee machines, and make it functional. The legal paperwork had to go in a clean name, so Dominic signed for it since he had military service and no criminal record. Inside, the place worked as a social club, business office, and dining stop linked closely to Tommaso's next door, where private backroom meals and meetings were often held. Roy used the club when he had to, but he had little respect for it and even less respect for the men who treated it like the center of their week. He thought most of them talked more than they earned, and he had already started referring to Paul with contempt inside his own circle. Our sources state the club as a problem almost as soon as it opened. It gathered too many known men in one place, and that made surveillance easy. Nino Gacci, who had spent years staying out of sight and letting business come to him, immediately saw the danger and even admitted to Dominic that the club could one day put him in prison or get him killed. Sundays were the worst of it, with different crews shaping up and men spilling onto the sidewalk in loud clothes, gold chains and bright shirts, while regular people walked by and understood perfectly well what kind of gathering they were looking at. Detectives and federal men noticed too. Kenny McCabe and FBI agent Anthony Nelson began watching the place, identified Roy there, and then finally connected Nino to Anthony Gatti, which closed a gap law enforcement had struggled with for years. From that point forward, the club did not just serve the family. It also served the police and the FBI as a clean place to take pictures, plate numbers, and note who was rising. Roy DeMeo hated the surveillance, but what bothered him more was that Paul still would not straighten him out. He felt he was predictable, disciplined, and productive, while Paul kept treating him like a dangerous blue-collar thief who brought in cash but not trust. In the spring of 1977, he came to the conclusion that only a bigger move would change Paul's mind. That opening arrived through Danny Grillo, who had ties to the West Side Irish crowd, later known publicly as the Westies. Danny knew Jimmy Coonan, knew the power struggle on the West Side, and knew that the faction around Coonan had nerve but lacked money. Roy saw the angle right away. If he financed Coonan and helped him take control, the Gambino family would not just gain a useful ally, it would gain a foothold inside a territory that had long resisted Italian control. Roy moved carefully but directly. He loaned Coonan $50,000 so he could start throwing money around West Side bars and make men dependent on him. He then went into joint work with that faction, including the hijacking of a truckload of video cassette recorders, and used the profits to strengthen the bond. The harder part came next. Roy decided Jimmy Coonan had to be tied to him through blood, the same way Roy himself had been tied upward through murder before him. The chosen target was Mickey Spillane, the older West Side figure Coonan hated personally and politically. Roy and Danny Grillo carried out the hit in Queens, with Chris, Henry, Joey, and Anthony nearby as support, and left the body where it would be seen, so the whole neighborhood would understand that the old order had been broken. What followed showed the limits of Roy's control, even when a plan seemed to be working. 2 days after Spillane was killed, Coonan and his men, with Danny involved, murdered Ruby Stein, an elderly loan shark whose ledger carried a long list of debts. They did it without consulting Roy. The killing wiped out money that several men owed and helped Coonan solidify himself on the West Side. But it also angered Roy, who did not like being cut out of a move that large after he had put up the money and the muscle that made Coonan possible. Even so, the larger result helped him. Roy could now point to a live alliance with a historically hostile Irish gang and argue that he had expanded the family's earning reach in a way Paul could not dismiss. That was the argument that finally worked. Mob historians state that Roy DeMeo finally got made at age 37, not through respect from Paul, but through usefulness that had become too large to ignore. The admission mattered a great deal to him on a personal level, but it changed almost nothing in the way he actually operated. He kept his drug business alive, kept moving marijuana and cocaine, and stayed active in lanes that Carlo Gambino and Paul both officially opposed. At the same time, one of the strongest criminal operations around him was not even his. It belonged to John Quinn, a car thief and retagger whose system was more advanced than the ones Nino had run years earlier, or the rougher tag work used by Chris Rosenberg. Quinn had blank forms, stamping equipment, police information, skilled thieves, and the ability to clean cars so well that people in Canarsie and Flatlands with the right contacts would rather buy from that underground market than from legitimate dealers. Mob historians state Roy bought cars and paper from him, Patty moved many of them, and the whole area became saturated with stolen luxury vehicles, passed off as legitimate. Quinn's weakness was not the car business. It was judgment. He was a married father of 6 who began carrying on with 19-year-old Cherie Golden and then did something Roy immediately recognized as reckless. He let her see too much. She handled phone traffic, typed false documents on a typewriter he gave her, knew pieces of the business, and accompanied him during parts of his work. Roy warned that she was a liability and should be removed from the picture. Quinn ignored him. Then pressure arrived from outside. One chop shop got raided. His name surfaced in a stolen bonds investigation, and he was subpoenaed before a grand jury. Facing a likely heavier sentence, Quinn chose cooperation over silence. For Roy, that was enough. He moved quickly, offered Joseph Bennett money to lure Quinn in, then raised the offer to include Cherie as well. Bennett never made the setup, but he also never warned his cousin. The actual killings were done through the Gemini setup. Quinn was led to believe there was business to discuss, including more paper and VIN work, and a Porsche deal Cherie was interested in. He went inside the rear apartment area while she stayed out in the Lincoln. Inside, he was shot in the head with a suppressed weapon. Outside, Joey Testa and Anthony Center distracted Cherie at the car windows, and Anthony fired into her head and face when the moment came. Roy wanted the bodies found, not hidden, so word would spread about what happened to men who cooperated and to the people too close to them. Quinn's body was left on Staten Island. Cherie's body stayed concealed in the sealed Lincoln for days until the smell brought police in Gerritsen Beach. The car also contained blank ownership documents and other material that tied the death back to the stolen car world. That same stretch showed how little control Nino Gacci truly had over Roy once things were moving. Roy had already embarrassed himself in public ways, including surveillance confrontations and fights, and now he had killed a teenage girl without first clearing it above him. When the newspapers hit, Nino immediately understood how bad this looked, not just morally, but politically. Paul's original objection to Roy had always been that he was too loose, too impulsive, and too likely to create trouble no one else asked for. Yet when Roy was brought in and his explanation laid out, Nino still defended him. He could not afford to admit that Roy had gone past him and acted on his own, since Nino had vouched for him. Paul's reaction was weak. Instead of making an example of Roy, he merely warned that not everyone had to be killed. That answer settled nothing, and in practice told Roy that even this could be survived. Our sources state that the section matters not just for the promotion itself, but for what it revealed about the whole structure around Roy DeMeo. He spent years demanding admission, then violated the family's own limits almost immediately after receiving it. The Veterans and Friends Club, built to strengthen Paul's rule, ended up exposing his men to investigators and helping law enforcement identify people they had only partly understood before. The Westies alliance gave Roy the final argument he needed to get made, but it also tied the family closer to another violent street faction with its own grudges and instability. The Quinn and Cherie murders then showed the final result of all of it. A man finally admitted into the family who now felt more protected, more important, and more convinced that murder could solve any threat in front of him. Paul saw the danger early, gave in anyway, and then answered weakly once the damage was done. Things did not stabilize after that. They got worse.